friends, and welcome to episode 37 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. Liz from Texas chimed in to tell me that as a school librarian who's just finished her first year, she's been listening to the podcast. She shared with me her summer goals, and that is to read all 20 of the Bluebonnet books. Our Texas listeners will know, but for those of us who don't live in Texas, the Bluebonnet books are books which are chosen by the students, and I'll read a quote from the website, which I'll attach in the show notes. Quote, "Since the first Texas Bluebonnet Award master list was created, the excitement about this Children's Choice Award has grown beyond the borders of Texas," said Sharon Lawler, TBA coordinator. Quote, "Our primary goals are to introduce children to a variety of quality books, develop critical thinking skills, and honor and encourage imaginative authors. The committee considers more than 500 books in order to select 5 outstanding books in various genres for grades 3, 4, and 5, and 6. What especially impressed me also is that Liz heads up her own book club, which meets each month. And I'll be honest, I cannot remember the last book I read that wasn't at a 4th grade reading level. I also want to thank Rebecca in Tennessee and Sandy in Massachusetts for your help in brainstorming this week for episodes which will air in Season 2. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our school librarians in North and South Dakota, as well as Wyoming. Joan from South Dakota and I crossed paths on Twitter, and I was very excited to learn that this podcast will be shared out in their next online class titled Reaching Out, Meeting the Needs of Rural School Librarians. I just find it very validating that others find this effort worthwhile. I want to welcome you and all our listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions as Season 2 is in the works, either on Facebook or Twitter, or using the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I started today, like I start every day, regardless if it is during the school year or the summertime, listening to the New York Times morning podcast called The Daily with host Michael Barbaro. As with all professionally made podcasts, it is polished. The sound of the quality of the interviews, the music interludes, the transitions from segment to segment. When this episode was wrapping up and the credits began, the host listed all the names of the production team. These were the individuals who contributed to the making of this podcast, which carries the New York Times name and all that it entails. I tallied a total of 29 people in the credits. Their job descriptions weren't included, but I'm sure that everyone who played a part behind the scenes in putting on this podcast called The Daily every weekday appreciated being mentioned. There is a reason that I don't have an equally impressive long list of credits at the end of each of my episodes. I don't have a research team, a sound team, a producer, an editor, or a studio. But at the end of Season 1, I can tell you what I do have. I have listeners. I have listeners in all 50 states and scattered across the world. I am so lucky to have found this community, and I'm very excited to be planning Season 2. Today's episode, in case you missed it, Season 1, is a brief survey of the podcast's archived episodes. For those of you who have binged the entire season, you may opt to skip the second half of this episode. For others who have joined more recently or have picked the handful of episodes to download, give me a chance to introduce you to what you've missed. I do plan to have just one more episode next week, as I will be spending Monday and Tuesday in Parma, Michigan, attending Nerd Camp. I also have an article which will be posted in an Australian publication later this month, and I'll make sure to send out a link on Twitter. You can find this podcast on Twitter at LMS_United, as well as my own Twitter handle at Herman Amy, HermonAmy. I also will be taking a break. I've promised my family that I will stop recording Season 1 for a while before I begin Season 2 at the end of August. I am inviting all of my listeners to contribute to Season 2's opening episode, Advice for a First-Year Librarian. What would you say to a first-year librarian? What do you wish you knew when you started? What should a first-year librarian know that will help them? I've included a link in the show notes to the podcast webpage where you can leave a SpeakPipe message to be included in this episode 1 of Season 2. If you prefer, you can either message me or email me your advice, and I'll be sure to read it aloud in the episode. Summer is a perfect time for educators to distance ourselves from the immediacy of school and our libraries. For years, I've used this downtime to explore the archived episodes of my favorite podcasts and to explore new podcasts which have sprung up during the year. I invite you to take a listen, and there's a chance you might decide to listen to a few more episodes of this podcast. What is fun is reflecting on this endeavor. In the process of recording these episodes, I've changed my own thinking on many topics. A perfect example would be how far I've come from when I recorded my first episode of the podcast called Weeding and when I recorded my 34th episode called Extreme Weeding. I do want to mention there is nuance with every episode, 2 sides to every coin, and I do try to give some balance when I tackle an issue. Understandably, listeners will take issue with some of my practices and my positions on certain topics. But rather than be apologetic, I ask that listeners appreciate that no 2 libraries are the same, nor are our teaching assignments. Our job descriptions, while they overlap, will vary wildly from district to district and state to state. As school librarians have always had to adapt and modify, much like the square peg in a round hole, so too does listening to one librarian require you to apply what you have heard to your own particular set of circumstances. Suggesting an albeit controversial position on something as divisive as students using Wikipedia or the practice of self-censorship isn't intended to create consensus. It's actually the opposite, really. Regardless of where we find ourselves in our career, it's important that we question our practices and consider what we can do to best serve the needs of our students and our staff. I would now like to give you 3 compelling reasons why you should listen to the past episodes recorded in this podcast. My first episode, Weeding, the Librarian's Dirty Little Secret. You should listen to this because it's my first episode. It's very cautious for so many reasons. I rely on tried and true formulas such as CREW and MUSTY. And then finally, I also provide how to respond when non-librarians push back to your efforts to weed your collection. My second episode, Discards, yet another dirty little secret. I provide lots of ways to use discards in your library program. I also include the mistakes I made in trying to discard books. And then finally, I share some strategies which have worked in getting rid of books which you no longer have on the shelves. My third episode is titled Purchasing. Who doesn't like to spend someone else's money? And the 3 reasons why you should listen to this episode include my list making 101, learn from my purchasing mistakes. I also include what factors I consider, short-term goals versus long-term investments. And then finally, where do I get the ideas for the titles I like to purchase? My 4th and 5th episodes go hand in hand. Episode number 4, Book Warden, Truth Hurts. I talk about finding the just right book and why that works in elementary libraries. I also explain when I have to be a book warden in my library and why I have to sometimes be a book warden in my library. Book Snob, Guilty as Charged, recognizes that being selective in when it comes to my collection is part of my job. I also explain why I have to appeal to the masses, and this ties into another episode I do later in the season called Give Them What They Want. Lastly, I make sure to discuss the importance of why we don't belittle any of the selections our children make when they check out books. Episode number 6, Classroom Libraries, Rivals or Partners. I launch into a rant about why I'm not a fan of Scholastic. I look at it from a librarian's perspective, and why classroom libraries might be seen as somewhat of a challenge to what we offer in the library. And yet, classroom teachers and librarians are both on the same team. We both have the same goals, and therefore we have good reason to work with one another, which works nicely into episode number 7, Collaboration, One Size Does Not Fit All. I can guarantee you there will be a follow-up episode on collaboration in season number 2. But in this episode, I discuss how we collaborate with teachers and teams and administrators in our buildings and with our district leadership. I talk about being proactive versus reactive with our collaborative efforts. I also discuss how we plan collaboration and sometimes when it just happens fortuitously. I also include how our schedules and our building assignments impact our ability to collaborate with people. For example, I teach 6 classes a day, and I'm spread across 4 different elementary schools. While I'm never going to be able to team teach with any of my teachers, I am certainly going to be able to find ways to support them. Episode 8, Live Your Best Library, was an episode I recorded after I presented at our state conference. And I didn't always attend my state conference, and so I give a lot of reasons why attending your state conferences should be a priority every year. I also talk about the benefits of serving on the planning committee and volunteering during the conference as well. I talk about the different offerings that our conference has, including roundtables and a cavalcade of local authors and shop talks for each of our different grade levels. And I also include a link to my own presentation, Live Your Best Library, and I talk through each of my slides. My 9th episode is called Got Assistance? Consider Yourself Lucky. And I have worked under each of these circumstances. I was a solo librarian with parent volunteers. I've been a solo librarian with student volunteers. And I've also been a librarian who works with an assistant who's a district employee. And I can honestly say, looking back, there are clearly advantages and disadvantages to every configuration, but there are certainly implications that have to be considered. My 10th episode is called Leveled Books, Unnecessary Evil. And I talked about how my district has a day of teacher-led PD on Election Day, and I included one of the sessions in my show notes. I taught and shared some of the considerations when you are leading training with teachers and your coworkers. I also address what happens when you have a library that's participating in AR and how to teach students to find the just right book and why that's a contentious issue with some librarians. I also look at student choice in the light of leveled books. Episode number 11 is called We Are the Lifelong Learners, and I share what I've learned over the last 12 years in purchasing books for libraries. I literally listed all of my purchasing errors. It's laughable, but we learn from them. I also discuss all the reasons why librarians are, by nature, lifelong learners. And then I shared a variety of journeys in becoming school librarians from some of my listeners on a discussion board. Episode 12, Our Voldemort, Wikipedia. This episode, perhaps more than any other episode I recorded during my first season, is the most controversial. My library experience has been entirely at the elementary level, and this has strongly shaped my views on Wikipedia. I share a great deal of how Wikipedia articles are edited and how they're vulnerable to vandalism. And had this been my 120th episode instead of my 12th, I would have provided a counterpoint, an interview with someone, a school librarian who has successfully incorporated Wikipedia into their lessons. I'm just not there yet. I don't know if I'd like to tackle this hot potato because mention Wikipedia to a room full of librarians and you've got civil war on your hands. Episode number 13 is called A Crisis in the Collection. And this was inspired because one of my books that is very much popular and well-loved in my library was pulled by the publisher and is no longer in print. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me because I wasn't aware of just how different our collections would be depending on, in this case, your proximity to a military base. In much the same way that I wrestled with having Dr. Seuss books on display in my library, offering a book which has caused such blowback as to be pulled from publication by the publisher has caused me to reflect on the decisions I make regarding my collection. You will have to listen to the episode to figure out what I did. Episode number 14 is called Holidays in Your Library. This was my first episode, which isn't evergreen. It's specific to the time I recorded, and that was the few weeks during Hanukkah and leading up to Christmas. I did spend some of the time in this episode talking about the importance of instructional rounds. This is one day during which we have the option to go and observe someone else doing our job. And I happen to think it's a very valuable way to spend a day learning from each other. Also worth mentioning is that regardless of the holiday, there are invariably disruptions to the school calendar which also interrupt library schedules and our routines. This episode addresses how our libraries have to oftentimes accommodate and adapt to events outside the walls of our space. Episode 15 is titled, It Made My Day When. I felt this episode was important because it's too easy to get bogged down in the negative aspects of our job. I shared inspiring letters from school librarians from around the country about what made their day. I also shared a strategy in promoting my library with our PTO and my principal, as well as a Google slideshow in the show notes all about mobile libraries, which I share with my students. Episode 16 is called Celebrity Authors and Politics in Our Collection. I, first of all, addressed the impact of Marie Kondo and what it could potentially mean for our collections. And I'm not sure why I care, but there seems to be a steady stream of celebrity authors who've decided that writing books for children is easy, and I took this opportunity to go down that rabbit hole. Furthermore, so too have politicians who have found the inspiration to write books for children. Politics has also found its way into our picture book collections, and I wanted the excuse to address that. If you feel like checking out the resources in the show notes, don't miss out on the episode because there is a ridiculous number of links. Episode number 17 is titled Self-Censorship is Real. And I'm fairly certain that if you objected to any of my episodes, it was the Wikipedia episode and it was self-censorship. I have become brutally honest with myself and therefore with my listeners. I am not some idealist who never makes compromises or falters on my ideals. Nowhere in my podcast is this more evident than in this episode. Listeners are asked to consider not just why we buy for our collection, but what we decide not to buy, and whether or not this was because of self-censorship. Episode number 18, Give Them What They Want. Like any adult who enjoys doting on children, a significant portion of my spending is on giving my students what they want to read. This episode also asks how you balance your purchasing priorities, and I also explore the prevalence of underwear and toilet humor in children's literature, and why it fares so prominently in our collections. Number 19, Podcasts and You. I could not have known when I recorded this episode, but this episode got the attention of listeners in Australia. I got an email from an editor of a school librarian publication and an invitation to write an article to be published later this month. If you couldn't tell already, I love podcasts, and I believe in the ability to unite communities of listeners and in a podcast platform as a resource. Podcasts are a free way to personalize your PD. I include a list in the show notes of my favorite podcasts on kid literature and on teaching and on technology, with the caveat that podcasts come in and out of existence. It's a rather fluid list. So if you happen to find something in the list which has stopped publishing episodes, take a look. They might be on a summer break, but it's worth taking a look. Episode number 20, Self-Published Books. I started off this episode describing my first ed camp experience and genrifying my horror section. I also began an exploration into how do we incorporate self-published books into our collections. And I also attempted to better understand and, honestly, to be less critical of self-published books and recognize that there is a need for them and a place for them in our collection. Episode 21 is titled Genius Hour. I did a lot in this episode. First of all, the beginning of the episode has nothing to do with Genius Hour. I share a fortnight video, which I use on my lesson in plagiarism, and make sure to find that in the show notes. I also go into some description about my bookmark contest, and those resources are in the show notes. And I also include a link to a Powtoon video, which I made to promote this program to my school. Then I discussed strategies for supporting classroom teachers who are doing passion projects or genius hours. I also go into some detail about how we can promote both our print and our digital collections, as well as connect with our public librarians in this effort. Episode 22 coincided nicely with Dr. Seuss's birthday. And I'm going to admit, librarian nostalgia is definitely hampering my ability to be completely objective. I address some of the issues and include links in the show notes to articles which take a scholarly look at the controversies over Seuss's work. I also include how I acknowledge Dr. Seuss's birthday with the stories I've chosen to use and the lessons I include in the show notes. Episode 23, Traveling Librarians, both in and outside of the loop. This is my wheelhouse. I've spent 5 years rotating in 4 different schools each year. The school combination changes. And so I use this platform to share not just the challenges of being a traveling librarian, but also what you might not realize are the advantages of being a traveling librarian. And even if you don't travel, you'll find this episode might be a little useful because I share strategies which can help you in being more successful in traveling from building to building. But I would also fair to say these are also considered best practice if you want to stay organized. Episode number 24, there's a substitute in your library. What could possibly go wrong? Oh my. This was a very fun episode to record because we all have nightmares about substitutes in our library and what could possibly happen. I first of all begin the episode by discussing how librarians oftentimes have to accommodate for book fair and how it affects our schedule. I also share strategies for how I got ready for a 3-day conference. And then finally, I use this opportunity to highlight the work of 3 leaders in our field, which I greatly admire. And lastly, I share just how perilous it could be to miss a couple days and what are some strategies we can use to help damage control when a sub is covering classes in your library and you are not there. Episode number 25, Learn, Grow, Lead. I start the episode by recommending 2 podcasts and a blog post to promote diversity in your collection. I also share strategies for appealing for funding for your PTO. I also share my interview with some school librarians at Michigan's largest EdTech conference. Episode number 26, Book Bounty Hunter, the Worst Job Ever. Also, a very fun episode to record, but I go into great detail about how I tackle the aspect of my job I hate the most, why so many of our books are lost in the first place, and why getting them returned isn't easy. And I also give a very impassioned rant about why I care if books get returned and what are some alternatives which have worked. Episode number 27. I've learned I still have a lot to learn. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, this episode has some tie-ins because it was recorded in anticipation of the final season airing the very next week. And basically, I divide this episode into 2 halves. Days when I know nothing, like Jon Snow, and I feel absolutely inept at work. And then there are days when I drink and I know things, Tyrion Lannister. There are days which I am just a font of information. And the fact is, my job leaves me being pulled in both of these directions. Episode number 28, Graphic Novels, Preaching to the Choir. I reflect on a webinar that I participated in and an article on the merits of graphic novels, which address the misconceptions as well as how we can dispel these. We need to consider all the gatekeepers and how we, working in the schools, will sometimes get pushback from the other gatekeepers, namely the parents and the classroom teachers. I also go into some detail about how we can be better advocates for our graphic novel collection, and more importantly, how we can support our students who love them. The show notes for this episode in particular are extensive. If you would like, make sure you take a look. And humble brag, I was invited to speak on a pre-conference panel, and it was because somebody had listened to this episode. So apparently somebody thought it was good. Episode number 29, Burnout and Self-Care. It's an occupational hazard. Why? What is it about our jobs which make us so susceptible to burnout? And what we can do to address burnout in a way that is safe and sustainable. Again, show notes are full of resources. Episode number 30 is Summer Plans for Your Library. I go into some detail about the Global Read Aloud, book recommendations for Ramadan, and Teacher Appreciation Week. I also discuss all the different things that happen to our library when we're not there, and some options for keeping your library open. Episode 31 addresses summer reading programs, and I explore some options such as sending school library books home for the summer, cross-promoting when school libraries promote the public library summer reading program, and lastly, strategies for working together with others who share the same goal, and that is preventing the summer slide with our students. Episode number 32, 45 minutes feels like forever. And this episode addresses what happens when our checkouts stop, but the classes keep on coming to our library. And that's for most of us who provide a fixed schedule and we are coverage for our teachers' planning or release time. I include lots of suggestions on how you can use your collection, suggestions in which you stay out of your collection because you're doing inventory, and activities inside your library and outside your library. Make sure you get the at-a-glance ideas in the resource page because it has helpful links to games and activities to kill time and have fun at the end of the year. Episode number 33 is called Gainful Employment. And I begin by offering some perspective for those of us who are looking for jobs and for those of us who hadn't been expecting to look for a job. I also include important recommendations for your resume and strategies for the interview process. And lastly, I include a very comprehensive list of potential interview questions. Make sure you visit the show notes. Episode 34 is called Extreme Weeding. And this is what happens when we open our eyes and look at our collection differently. I do offer some alternatives to books that have been weeded, and then I include the 3 areas which once had immunity, and now I look at, which would be the classics, award winners, and our reference section. 35 is called Self-Advocacy. We are the resource. I begin with an essay I wrote for my state magazine called What's in a Name and Why Our Job Titles Will Never Truly Represent All We Do. I mention strategies for promoting ourselves as a resource in our school and in our district, and I recognize that it is our responsibility, you and me, to make sure that the teachers all know what we can do to support them and their students. Episode 36 is ISTE 19. And this is when I reflected on the 4-day conference in Philadelphia. If you ever think you might want to attend an ISTE conference, for example, 2020 Anaheim, take a listen to this episode. It will give you an idea of what you can expect from the largest international EdTech conference. I also go into great detail about how I was able to network with school librarians and included lots of resources for school librarians in the show notes. I do have a few quick reminders. I will record one more episode, and that'll be next week when I get home from Nerd Camp. And I'll make sure to include some strategies for anybody who is hoping to replicate a Nerd Camp where you live. Also, please make sure to reach out with your advice for your first year school librarians, and I'll be sure to mention you when the episode posts in late August. I would like to extend a special thank you to everyone who has made this season so wonderful and fulfilling and meaningful to our listeners. And your feedback gives me a lot of direction in the upcoming episodes that we'll be recording in Season 2. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out either on Facebook or Twitter or using the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I'd like to thank you for listening today. The topic for our next episode will be Nerd Camp, Parma, Michigan. I hope you will tune in.